events that the community had according to its calendar, and perhaps also as accommodation overnight for people who were passing through. And one of the events that the village might use the hall for would be feasting. And as you can imagine, we're very fond of feasting. Oh yes. In fact, we've eaten very well in the last couple of days here. Oh yes. Good food and drink. Ale, mead and fine wine. Oh yes. And when we're doing this, especially in the hall, well, then of course the fire will be burning here, people seated on the benches, and after a while, when people have eaten and drunk their fill, then they like to be entertained, and there are various kinds of entertainment. Music, of course, poetry, and storytelling. And storytelling is very important indeed, because, well, apart from the entertainment itself, it's a way of reminding us about the history of our people. Because as you know, well, in the 5th century AD, that's when the Angles, the Saxons and the Jutes first came here to the island of Britain. And before that, well, they'd lived across the North Sea, in northern Germany, and in Denmark, and elsewhere in Scandinavia. And so, many of their earliest stories, well, they were concerned with their ancestors who lived in the old tribal homelands around the Baltic Sea. And, well, you may have heard of a great epic poem called Beowulf, a mighty hero who fought 2 water demons and at last a terrifying dragon. And Beowulf, of course, he was one of the people called the Geats. The Vikings called them the Gauts. And the Geats, they lived in southern Sweden. Geatland, their kingdom was called. And Geat is also often a nickname for Woden, king of the gods. Odin, to give him his Viking name. And, well, it's also often used in men's names. And there was, in fact, a legendary king, still quite a young man. He was called Geat, and his kingdom was there in southern Sweden. And, well, he'd long since come of age, become a young man, and while the prince, everyone was confident that when he succeeded his father, he'd make an excellent ruler himself. He'd already distinguished himself upon the battlefield, commanding their warriors, protecting the borders of their kingdom. Please feel free to come in.
Yeah, go for some floor, darling. Thanks, love. Sorry for disrupting.
That's all right. All right. And, well, Geat, he decided that the time had come to get married. And he'd fallen in love with a noble woman of fine ancestry. Matilde, her name was. She lived on an island, well, just offshore. And, well, it was all planned out. The 2 families had met and discussed the matter, and Geat, he'd already paid a bride price to show that he was worth marrying. And, well, this consisted of many fine things: gold, jewellery and ornaments, animals, land, and all the honours that came of becoming a princess of the royal family. And all the preparations had been made for the feast, which was to be held in Geat's kingdom. And now he rode south with his warriors, and they got to the shoreline and took a boat across the water. Now, in the meantime, Princess Mathilde, well, who's soon to become the princess, of course, that distinguished young woman, she had been making her own preparations, and she was dressed, well, impeccably, with a silken scarf to veil her head, and a long dress with golden brooches and beads of flawless amber strung between them, looking every inch like a young queen. However, if you look closely, you'd have noticed that Mathilde's eyes, they were somewhat bloodshot and shadowed, and you might have guessed that she had not been sleeping properly. And if that was your conclusion, you'd be right, because she'd been having terrible dreams, and every night without fail for the last few weeks, the same dream each time, that she'd fallen into running water. She was below the surface and couldn't get out again. And there in the water, a face was grinning back at her that looked almost as if it was made of the water itself. And this terrified her. But she had no idea what to do about it. And, well, as soon as Geert and his retinue arrived, she went with them, with her maid to accompany her. And, well, once they'd taken the boat across the sound of water, then they got on horseback and set off to the north. And on the way, there was a wide wood, and this they entered. However, Geert, who was in the lead, when he looked over his shoulder, he saw that his bride-to-be was weeping, crying her eyes out. He had no idea what the trouble might be, and so he asked her, "Are you crying because you've married me? Are you crying because of all the lands your family's received? Are you crying because of all the gold? Or are you crying because you'll be sitting at my table?" And she said, "No, I'm not weeping for any of those things, for the land, the animals, the gold, or the honour of becoming your bride. No, I'm weeping because of my golden hair that will never rest when it's my time to die and meet the gods in a fine burial mound in the tradition of our ancestors. No, instead it will float and rot in water forevermore." And, well, Geert, he told her that she should stay strong and try to ignore the dream. But Mathilde said, "It's a vision of my fate." And fate, well, as we all know, it's been woven on a great loom up there in the land of the gods by the weird sisters, the Norns. They weave the fates of everyone and everything in all the 9 worlds upon that loom. Nothing can change it. They continued on through the forest, and presently, ahead of them, they saw a wooden bridge crossing a river. This was called Vending's Bridge. And now Mathilde grew very apprehensive indeed. And Geert said to her, "As soon as we've got married, I'll build that bridge so strong it will never collapse." But Mathilde, well, she wasn't impressed, and she brought up the rear on her finely equipped horse. And then, when her horse was halfway across, the horse stumbled, and it caught one of its horseshoes between the planks. And the horse, with its rider, Mathilde, plunged into the surging waters of the river. Now, a very short while later, Gaiat, who, as we said, was taking the lead, looked behind him and he saw no sign of his bride-to-be. "What's happened to Matilde?" "We haven't seen her since Vending's Bridge," they said. And so they returned, and they looked along the whole stretch of river near the bridge. They saw no sign of her. And Gaiat feared the worst. And so he turned to his most trusted retainer, told him to take a horse. "Go now," he said. "Ride to my family homestead. Say this to my father, that Matilde is in the river. Say this to my mother, Matilde is lying in the water. Say this to my sister, that my harp is in the chest. And tell my brother, the harp is in the compartment within the chest. They'll understand that. As soon as you're given the harp, come straight back to me." And so, Gaiat's retainer, he rode so hard and so fast, he exhausted 5 horses getting back to the royal hall. Nevertheless, he returned with the harp. And while he was gone, Gaiat could only worry, staring at the surging water, hoping against hope that he could rescue Matilde. And finally, the harp arrived with the retainer who brought it. And Gaiat took the harp, a lyre, out of the deerskin bag and set his fingers to the strings. And the first time he strummed the instrument, all the birds flew off the branch of every tree in the wood. The second time, a great bear was forced out of its lair, blinking sleepily in the sunlight. And the third time, he struck a chord. A nearby mother-to-be, well, she gave birth to a fine, healthy baby. Every time he played the lyre, life and vitality sprang into the world. Now he sat by the riverbank with the harp in hand. He pulled notes from the lyre and he sang spells. And then he saw, rising up, the princess herself and her horse, but also along with them the face of a water elf. And this water elf, as you probably guessed, well, he'd fallen in love with the princess a long time before and had been determined to have her. And he was tugging on her silken headscarf, desperate to keep her in his watery kingdom. But Gaiat played and played again, and finally the elf had to surrender. Matilde and her horse were retrieved from the water, and immediately she threw herself into Prince Gaiat's arms. "Blessed is the mother who has such a son," she said to him. And of course, not long after that, the two of them had their hand fasting, their wedding ceremony, which went wonderfully. There was a fine feast, and well, everyone had a wonderful time. But for now, that's the end of this story, and thank you very much indeed for listening. And hail to the speaker, and hail to those who listen. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you. Well told, my lord. Please feel free to carry on exploring the village and ask any questions you'd like of the Anglo-Saxons and Vikings here today. Thank you.